Okay, so hopefully everyone has successfully navigated over to the Arabic and Spanish language channels. We'd like to thank Oxfam for including us in this webinar series. The webinar is part of a series of webinars that have taken place over the past weeks. So we hope that you've been able to join in some of those. They've been organized by the Gender Justice and Extractive Industries Working Group and explore different policy areas related to women's rights, the extractive industries, and gender issues. You can find more information about the series, including you can watch recordings of previous sessions that you may have missed in the link that we're about to put into the chat here. So have a look at the link in the chat, and you can follow up to get back to that after. So I'm Aubrey Menard. I'm a gender advisor with the Natural Resources Governance Institute, or NRGI.
And I'm Elizabeth Moses, Environmental Rights and Justice Associate with the World Resources Institute. The research findings that we will present today, drawn from our report, The State of Gendered Extractive Governance, is funded by the Open Government Partnerships Multi-Donor Trust Fund managed by the World Bank. It has been conducted by NRGI in partnership with the World Resources Institute. In 2019, the Open Government Partnership, or OGP, a 78-country initiative aimed at promoting responsible, accountable, and inclusive governance, launched the Break the Rules campaign to encourage companies to be more intentional, strategic, and ambitious in bringing women and gender perspectives into open government. While countries in OGP have made open government commitments in relation to the extractives and natural resources sector, the vast majority of these commitments are gender blind, meaning they fail to acknowledge or address the differentiated needs of women, men, and gender minorities. The project hopes to inform a new generation of gendered OGP commitments in relation to the extractive sector, building on the momentum created by the Break the Rules campaign and the growing attention now being paid to advance gender equity in the extractive sector. While we do not endorse reliance on mineral resource extraction, we believe that women and gender minorities should be involved in the whole extraction process, from influencing if, where, and when extraction occurs in determining the effects on their communities. Next slide, please. As there is systematic exclusion of women and gender minorities in the research extractive sector, we are discussing recommendations for promoting the meaningful inclusion and participation of women and gender minorities. One of the most significant stakeholders in governing women and gender minorities' participation in the sector are governments, which set the tone and regulations for extractive companies and other stakeholders in how to address the role of women and gender. However, it can often be difficult to critically identify and assess the means through which governments promote gender equity beyond what is often simply a publicity campaign without any substantive foundation. To assess how governments acknowledge and respond to the systemic inequality of women and gender minorities in the resource extraction industry, we turn our attention to governments' legislative commitments. Laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines are the mechanisms through which governments transform political priorities, principles, and commitments into actions and requirements. And so we ask, where and how are governments speaking about women and gender in the extractive sector? And what can we learn about their views on women's inclusion in policymaking through their text? We set out to discover whether and how countries rich in oil, gas, and minerals currently reflect the rights of women and gender equity in legal and policy frameworks. There are a myriad of methods through which we can advocate for government to promote the participation of women and gender minorities that will lead towards direct action. Understanding the mechanisms through which countries are currently attempting to address the gender differentiated impacts of the extractive sector is critical to the effort of drafting better commitments that are more likely to create gender transformative change. Our research examines the laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines in 12 countries: Argentina, Canada, Colombia, Ghana, Indonesia, Kenya, Mongolia, Morocco, Nigeria, Peru, Sierra Leone, and Tunisia. In these 12 countries, we identified a total of 30 documents that were directly relevant in that they specifically govern the sector, such as national oil or mining laws, and that also mention women, gender, or sex.
Thanks, Liz. We found that governments most commonly mention women, gender, or sex in their laws as compared to policies, regulations, guidelines, or other documents. The majority of laws that we found address women in two ways. The first way is that they established governing bodies to oversee extractive sector functions and included simple quotas requiring women's participation on these governing boards. Most commonly, the quotas required the participation of only 1 to 2 women, which in all cases constituted less than 22% of the governing board. The second way that these laws included women is that they prohibited women from working underground or on mining sites. Seeing the frequency with which women are prohibited from working on mining sites led us to learn more about the history of such prohibitions. In the countries that we analyzed, we found laws prohibiting women's work in mines in Argentina, Morocco, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Tunisia. Though the Sierra Leonean and Argentinian laws are still technically enforced, they do not seem to be followed in practice. Several other countries in our sample had similar laws in place before they were repealed or amended in the last 20 years. These include Colombia, Ghana, Indonesia, Kenya, and Mongolia. Across the world, 60 countries still have laws on the books that restrict women's employment in mining. These laws are most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, where 1/3 of countries prohibit women's work in mines. Many of these laws originated from the British Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, which removed women and children from the coalface of British underground mines due to a Victorian moral disapproval of women and children doing dirty and dangerous work. Though women had previously worked side by side with men in the Mines and Collieries Act had an immediate and profound impact on women's employment. Rather than protecting women from dangerous work as it had intended, it instead deprived women from higher paid employment that they had previously secured, and instead forced them into other hazardous, less formal work. The Mines and Collieries Act not only affected British women's work, but soon impacted women throughout the world. Throughout the British Empire, parallel legislation was enacted in the British colonies. In the 1920s and 1930s, the International Labor Organization adopted several protectionist conventions around women's labor in the mining industry, prohibiting women's underground work and also limiting women's ability to work at night. These provisions became enshrined in the governing documents of ILO member states, pushing women further into lower status, lower wage work, particularly in the global South. By limiting women's participation and the definition of what it means to work in the sector, women's work through the extractive value chain has suffered from invisibility, which can manifest through lack of unionization, poor organization, and poor policies and protections. Today, while women's overall participation in the global workforce is 47%, women make up only 22% of the oil and gas workforce and only 14% of the industrial mining workforce. Women's participation in artisanal mining is estimated to be significantly higher, which speaks to how these prohibitions have forced women into work that is more dangerous and less formal, regulated, and lucrative. These prohibitions on women's work continue to have a dramatic effect on women's participation in the extractive sector and ultimately the wage gap. Technical mine site jobs, such as engineer, geologist, and analyst, are often higher paying than clerical or administrative jobs in the sector. However, because of these restrictive provisions and their legacies, women in the sector are overwhelmingly employed in lower paid functions. For example, in Canada, which has one of the highest rates of women's participation in the extractive sector in the world, only 5% of mine site workers are women. Similar trends have been found in Chile, Peru, and Mongolia, where women are overwhelmingly involved in lower paid administrative support work for the sector, rather than in higher paying mine site roles. Even though these restrictive prohibitions on women's work have been lifted in many countries, their legacies persist. Centuries of women's absence on mine sites has led to cultures and norms that still impact their unequal participation in the sector. Further, women's lack of experience working in mining and underground has contributed to fewer women holding management or corporate board positions. A similar gap is observed in the oil and gas industry, where globally women hold only 10 to 30% of field jobs. This lack of experience contributes to women's selection for leadership roles. There is a significant decline from women's global participation in middle management, where it's 25%, to senior leadership roles, where it drops off to 17%. In our research, that's the next slide, please. It was also interesting to see how the terms women and gender were used. In general, we found references to women reflected somewhat stereotypical views of the role and status of women. We noted that the use of the word women was more common in documents adopted prior to 2011, whereas more recent documents adopted from 2011 to 2020 increasingly use the term gender, though the use of the term woman still dominates. Unfortunately, the term gender was most frequently used as a proxy for woman, and strategies for the inclusion and promotion of gender minorities were largely absent in the documents that we found. A limited number of the documents use the phrase women and children. This phrase itself undermines the goal of promoting gender equality because it connotes that women are unequal to men and that they, or we I should say, like children, are weak and in need of protection from those in power who are presumably men. It prevents women from making choices like adults about what employment to pursue. This usage is out of line with international standards, particularly the International Labor Organization's Discrimination, Employment, and Occupation Convention. For meaningful systemic change to occur, lawmakers must acknowledge the ways that extractive governance impacts societal groups and the relations between them differently, and address the root causes of inequality rather than simply seeing women as a homogeneous, vulnerable group. Moreover, lawmakers would do well to take an asset-based approach to extractive governance, thinking of women and gender minorities not as vulnerable groups, but instead considering the strengths of their diverse communities and looking for ways to enhance and realize their assets.
Next slide, please. So what did the documents that we found actually aim to do? We found that the mechanisms that the documents hope to use to promote gender equality can be placed into three categories: enabling women's participation, disaggregating data by gender, and creating transparency measures. In terms of women's participation, some of the documents that we reviewed required the participation of individual women and, to a lesser extent, required the participation of organizations representing women. As discussed previously, some documents introduced quotas for women's participation. Other documents aim to create broad changes to the culture around women's participation, but often lacked firm requirements or specific mechanisms for doing so. Some countries aim to increase women's benefit from the sector directly through value and job creation. For example, in Mongolia's 2019 Geology, Mining, Petroleum, and Heavy Industry Sector Gender Responsive Policy, the government plans to set quotas for women's high-level participation in the sector in both public and private spheres. This document is supported by an action plan that is broken into two phases. In the first phase of the plan, the Mongolian government plans to conduct gender mainstreaming and capacity building targeted at integrating a gender perspective into policy and regulatory reform, planning, budgeting, and monitoring and evaluation. Enabling an environment that addresses gender-specific needs adequately in all levels of public and private spheres of the extractor sector. Implementing a strategy to combat gender stereotypes and discrimination, and fostering partnerships with civil society. Canada's new Impact Assessment Act, which creates a new Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, is another interesting example. Although its requirements are not just limited to the mining sector, the 2019 Act includes references to Indigenous women in terms of adverse impacts that a physical activity may have on the rights of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Any scientific information and Indigenous knowledge, including the knowledge of Indigenous women, must be taken into account in impact assessments. This impact assessment consultation must consider the intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors such as age, place of residence, ethnicity, social economic status, employment status, or disability. However, it should be noted that to date, there is little implementation-related guidance or limited documentation of promising practices. Canada's intersectional approach can also be found in its GBA Plus or Gender-Based Analysis Plus requirements. GBA Plus ensures that the differential impacts of people of all genders are considered when policies, programs, and legislation are developed. It includes a multi-step process to identify the context, gender and diversity issues, and unpack underlying assumptions when assessing the potential implications of any policy or program on Canada's diverse populations. It also requires government agencies to gather evidence through research and consultation before making recommendations. The second category is data disaggregation by gender. Despite broad recognition that disaggregated data is important both to the developing effective interventions and assessing the impact of legal and policy frameworks, little disaggregated data available about the sector's gender effects exists. Our sample of 30 documents, few require the government or company to collect disaggregated data. Only 6 of the documents that we found made any reference to disaggregated data. They come from 3 countries, Colombia, Peru, and Mongolia. However, these few documents that require gender disaggregation largely understand gender to be nothing more than the binary of women and men. Consequently, even in the case that gender disaggregated data is collected, gender minorities will be excluded or miscounted in data that will be used to inform policy and decision making. This has the effect of compounding the invisibility of gender minorities and obfuscating issues that impact them. Conversely, creating visibility through data collection and disaggregation can contribute to reducing stigma and facilitate additional data collection and research, as well as advance policies and the development of services to address the needs of gender minority populations. The third category is transparency measures. Open, transparent government in which citizens are able to access and understand data can create more equal participation, accountability, responsive governance, service delivery, and gender and sustainability outcomes. Transparency and data accessibility can help ensure that governments are responsive to the diverse and gendered needs of all its citizens. However, most of the documents that we found do not explicitly require transparency in relation to their specific gender provisions. A couple examples of documents that do include transparency provisions include the 2019 Canadian Minerals and Metal Plan, which requires that the government create a public platform to present job opportunities in this sector and encourage the application of more diverse applicants, including women. Also, Colombia's 2018 human rights policy for the energy and mining sector mentions the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Sustainable Development Goals as inspirations for the country's commitment to transparency. This document recognizes transparency and information accessibility as a way to enable participation. Next slide, please. In order to make sense of the documents and evaluate their potential impact, we analyzed the documents using an adapted version of the UNDP's Gender Results Effectiveness Scale. This measures the gender impact of interventions across 5 categories. Gender negative means the outcomes aggravate or reinforce gender inequalities. This includes gender exploitive approaches that take advantage of existing gender inequalities, behaviors, and stereotypes in pursuit of project objectives. Gender blind means the results had no attention to gender and failed to acknowledge various different needs. Gender targeted means the results focused on the number or equity of men, women, and marginalized people, such as looking for a 50-50 balance. Gender responsive means the results addressed the differential role and needs of men and women and looked for equitable distribution of benefits, resources, and rights. And finally, gender transformative, which sees results contributing to changes in norms, cultural values, power structures, and the roots of gender inequalities. The UNDP created this multifaceted scale in order to measure the impacts of interventions. Because we are only looking at the text of these documents and not their actual implementation, we are not able to assess whether these documents are actually gender transformative or responsive, targeted, blind, or negative. Rather, our assessment is limited to the document's potential.
Sorry, everyone, I was muted. So this was the distribution of the 30 documents that we focused on for our research. As most of the documents were gender targeted, meaning that they looked to increase women's or other groups' participation in the extractive industries through quotas or other programs, the primary aim was not to address the structural causes of gender inequality. As we mentioned previously, in the documents that we analyzed, countries often use simple quotas to increase women's participation. For example, Ghana's 1993 Minerals Commission Act establishes the commission and requires that 2 of the 7 commission members are women. In fact, all 3 of the Ghanaian laws that we identified included similar quotas, and in each case, this was the sole reflection of women and gender in these laws. Other approaches to increasing women's participation included requirements that women be consulted on local development initiatives related to extractive company operations. However, these requirements were general in their formulation, and it was not clear how they could be implemented or verified. Other documents look to require the participation of individual women or the participation of organizations representing women. Some documents aim to create gender transformative change by altering the culture around women's participation. But even these more ambitious documents often lacked firm requirements or specific mechanisms for creating the change which they prescribed. It simply isn't enough for a document to make a nominal commitment to women's participation or gender equality. The document must include clear provisions that are verifiable, meaning that oversight actors are easily and freely able to check to see that the document's provisions are being implemented. We looked across the documents to see whether it would be possible to verify if the provisions of the law, policy, regulation, or guideline were implemented in practice, or whether there were any measures to enable enforcement. What we found is that while documents included language that express a commitment to some form or action or ambition in relation to gender equality or the rights of women, very few of these documents contain provisions that are verifiable or provide enforcement mechanisms. For example, a document may include an intent to consult women when crafting extractive governance policy, but without a requirement for the government or a company to provide verification of with whom they have consulted, these documents may amount to little more than unfulfilled promises. The simpler provisions, such as requiring a certain number of women on a governing board, are easily verifiable. This highlights another issue. Those commitments that are easily verifiable are often unambitious. These provisions that had greater potential to be gender transformative because they address the root causes of gender inequality or dealt with women's economic empowerment often lacked obvious means of checking implementation or enforcement. In order to have the potential to create gender transformative change, commitments must be both ambitious and verifiable. It is necessary for us to think about how the recommendations that we included could be verifiable and how oversight actors can hold governments accountable for these commitments to action.
Great, thanks, Audrey. Our research is still in its early stages, and while we have learned much from analyzing the text of these documents, we have not yet researched their implementation and effects. As such, it is not yet possible for us to offer draft language for gender transformative laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines. However, we are able to draw recommendations from our textual analysis of the documents that we found for these 12 countries. The first is that commitments should be ambitious. Many of the documents that we reviewed contained gender provisions that were unambitious. For example, the simple quota requirements contained in Ghana's documents, even if well implemented, will likely do little to transform gender relations in the country's extractive sector or beyond. These quotas provide for nominal women's representation in select governing bodies. However, provisions often do not require that the women appointed to these positions have any particular qualifications or have historically represented women's interest in any demonstrable way. While overly rigorous requirements could be used to justify the exclusion of women from these positions with no requirements stated, it is also possible that women appointed may be chosen to fill these quota specifically because they are likely to be compliant with dominant cultures. Research shows that in order to affect gender transformative change, there needs to be a critical mass of women, more than 1/3, in leadership positions. Otherwise, women are stereotyped, tokenized, and easily overshadowed or dismissed. It is not until this critical threshold is reached that perceptions begin to shift and fundamental change begins to occur. Documents should use quotas to require the presence of women and gender minorities in significant amounts, not only on governing boards of organizations, but through the entire extractive governance structure and supply chain in order for gender transformative change to occur. Beyond creating quotas for the participation of women and gender minorities, documents should be ambitious about creating systemic change. For example, documents can be designed to require transparency on benefit impact agreements, promote the collection and transparency of data on local procurement and employment, and can even build interventions to specifically deal with the gender differentiated impacts prevalent in extractive affected communities. More than having ambitious goals for women and gender minorities participation, documents should also be bold in the type of change which they aim to create, from shifting culture in the extractive industries to changing the way decision-making occurs in affected communities to realigning economic power. Reform of the extractive sector has the potential to drastically impact the lives of people in the affected communities and countries, and as such, in creating documents, governments should carefully consider what the desired and likely impact of the documents may be and aim to create gender transformative change.
As stated previously, in order to affect gender transformative change, commitments must mandate significant women and gender minorities participation throughout the extractive governance sector and supply chain. However, because of historic and ongoing structural inequalities, mandating such participation is not sufficient to create gender transformative change. To rectify these inequalities, governments will need to promote overarching changes to national policy, enforcement, and awareness regarding areas such as parental leave, anti-discrimination protections, sexual harassment prohibitions, as well as sectoral specific policies. To set women and gender minorities up for successful participation in the extractive sector, commitments should provide for the education, job training, and skills building necessary to address historic and structural inequalities that prevent women and gender minorities' full participation in the sector. For example, the Canadian Mining and Metals Plan calls for the inclusion of more Indigenous women in the sector and says that this can be facilitated with training in the trades, post-secondary education, and entrepreneurial mentoring. While the plan does not offer detail or targets for this training, education, or mentoring, its inclusion acknowledges that addressing structural inequalities will require a multifaceted and systemic approach. Extractive sector workplaces cannot simply include more women or gender minorities. They must also be welcoming places for women and gender minorities to work. And for extractive sector workplaces to truly create gender transformative change, they must address the gender differentiated role that work has in society. The Mongolian, and bear with me, this is a very long name, Geology, Mining, Petroleum, and Heavy Industry Sector Gender Responsive Policy Action Plan of Implementation 2019 to 2026 aims to create such change through provisions that address the fundamentals of workplace discrimination and accessibility. The document says, quote, policy and planning processes that detect and minimize differing roles and responsibilities of women and men, employees and their families, and households that might prevent women's career advancement or push them into less secure and lower paid jobs, while restricting men's contribution and capacities to participate in family affairs, thus potentially increasing their health-related risks. Therefore, adequate work-life planning and pursuing a relevant work-life balance policy is one of the fundamental requirements for promoting gender equality. end quote. Creating compatible workplaces to address the needs of different genders will involve conversations with diverse stakeholders and deeper thinking about the needs of communities. In the case of Sierra Leone, for example, the artisanal mining policy for Sierra Leone of 2018 articulates that women's participation in artisanal mining has unintentionally led to children missing educational opportunities due to lack of alternative childcare. In this case, ambitiously facilitating women's participation in the sector will mean addressing childcare, child safety, and education issues. Several of the documents that we reviewed require that companies solicit women's input when conducting environmental impact assessments or in building community development agreements. For example, Peru's 2012 regulation of the prior consultation law states companies should include women in prior consultation processes for all projects that affect Indigenous peoples' communal rights. However, while this document and others like it often call for women's consultation, these documents rarely specify what that consultation should entail, put quantifiable measures on the number of women that should be consulted and on what topics, or establish mechanisms that ensure that women's inputs influence project trajectories or governance. Commitments should seek women and gender minorities' input into extractive governance by developing guidance for gender-responsive stakeholder consultation and facilitating the participation of national and local women's organizations, including through increased funding. In order to make sure that their input is substantive and creates an impact, documents should quantify the number of women and gender minorities to be consulted, the mechanism and topics for their consultation, and the ways in which their inputs will be translated into governance. They should also create mechanisms to provide women and gender minorities with information that helps them understand their rights and the issues before them. Additionally, they should consider holding women-only consultation meetings to ensure that women's voices are heard and facilitate safe transportation and childcare so that women may attend meetings. Finally, as we discussed, many documents that restrict women's participation in the extractive sector are a direct legacy of British colonialism. These provisions have prevented women from taking on jobs in the sector, which are typically higher paid, and have consequently deprived them of the experience needed to participate in the upper levels of management and decision-making. In order to remedy this, country governments should remove these antiquated provisions from their documents and aggressively pursue job training and recruitment in order to remedy their legacy.
Next slide. Thirdly, commitments should be verifiable. As we said earlier, lofty language that promises women's empowerment and an end to inequality was common in the documents that we reviewed. However, if provisions are not verifiable, these goals are likely to amount to little more than unfulfilled promises. For a commitment to be verifiable, it must include quantifiable goals and targets, set timelines for their achievement, and establish a plan to monitor and evaluate progress. As prescribed by the Open Government Partnership, commitments should begin by addressing the status quo and then set a target for improvement. For example, in its commitment to increasing the number of women in the mining labor force, the Canadian Minerals and Metal Plan first states that it is currently at about 14% and then makes a commitment to increase it to 30% by 2030. This commitment is verifiable in that A, it sets a target, and B, sets a time frame during which that target should be achieved. Commitments can go a step further by setting intermediary benchmarks for targets. In the Canadian example, setting a midpoint target of 23% women's employment in the mining labor force by 2025, for example, would allow the government, company, and oversight actors to monitor progress towards the commitment and push for accountability if the goal was not being met before the far-off 2030 date was reached. Further, commitments should address how governments intend to monitor and evaluate their progress toward the goals that they have set. Funding mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation may need to be addressed in associated planning documents to create clear mandates and lines of accountability for implementing gender equality and mainstreaming initiatives.
In conducting this research, we have often found ourselves frustrated by the lack of gender disaggregated data available, particularly data that disaggregates for gender minorities. While many countries are making commitments to gender equity, without this data, countries often develop policies that don't account for the unique experiences and needs of men, women, and gender minorities. This disaggregation should pay particular attention to gender and its intersections with characteristics such as age, disability, and ethnicity. Governments are working to address labor biases, create diversification strategies that are gender inclusive, build inclusive tender practices, create enhanced environmental monitoring, and develop gender responsive revenue management. However, without data disaggregation, it's difficult to know who is participating and to hold governments accountable. As discussed, oil, gas, and mining projects can impact people differently, often due to their gender or other identities. As countries work to develop governing documents that address these differentiated impacts, the collection of gender disaggregated data will be crucial to addressing whether these documents are having the intended effect. Commitments should require the collection of gender disaggregated data for this data to be analyzed when creating policy. For example, Colombia's 2018 Human Rights Policy for the Energy and Mining Sector, which encourages the design of specific sectoral policies to promote women's participation, requires the Ministry of Mines and Energy to use gender disaggregated data to evaluate its internal policies. Further, governments should establish clear areas of responsibility by providing guidelines, tools, communications, open data platforms, and public institutions for data use. Gender data collection and disaggregation should be inclusive of gender minorities and proceed using leading international practices, such as data protection policies and sensitization training for data collectors.
Fifth, commitments should require transparency. When extractive sector governance and processes are shrouded in opacity, men, who overwhelmingly occupy positions of power, are allowed proprietary access to information and are thus able to safeguard their power and control how community resources are spent. When information is transparent, women and other marginalized groups have greater opportunities to participate in governing processes and hold their representatives accountable. For example, in the case of mineral royalties paid to mining affected communities, if these financial flows and budgets are transparent, all community members are able to see how money is being spent and to advocate for spending priorities that meet their needs. In developing transparency commitments for the extractive sector, countries should consider developing these in line with existing frameworks such as the Open Government Partnership and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, a global standard for good governance in oil, gas, and mineral resources. In addition to implementing the EITI's general transparency provisions, countries should incorporate the EITI's gender requirements in the extractive sector governance documents. Finally, commitments should connect to ongoing efforts. Next slide, please. There. Obviously, the life cycle of oil, gas, and mineral extraction involves a wide range of legal, economic, and policy decisions, often controlled by different government ministries and offices, such as taxation and revenue distribution, to social and environmental impacts, and EIAs. Further, many countries have created country-wide strategies and plans that outline broad and strategic national approaches to gender transformative and women equality interventions, or include gender equity in their government's constitutions. To have a gender transformative impact, gender provisions should be mainstreamed throughout all laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines that govern the extractive sector. While overarching commitments to gender equality in constitutions makes a powerful statement about a country's founding values, these commitments must also be reflected in actionable and enforceable policies directly governing the extractive sector to create provisions for gender equality. For example, if a country makes a commitment to gender equality in its constitution, that commitment should be reflected in the way the mineral royalty payments are governed and dispersed, the regulations that dictate how companies should operate and interact with mining affected populations, and the guidelines that can offer more detail on how gender transformative change can be implemented. Further, documents should be developed with careful consideration of what other document provisions are already in place so they do not create conflicting requirements. For example, quotas or other requirements established in one governing document should be the same or compatible with those established in another. While not in direct conflict with each other, the quotas in Ghana's documents, for example, seem arbitrary. In establishing commissions and setting quotas for women's representation on their board of directors, the number of women required for each commission is often different. Some require one woman, while the other requires two, and these quotas are seemingly unrelated to this overall size of the board. Quotas such as these should aim to establish a uniform percentage of women and gender minorities in leadership positions. And if the aim is to create gender transformative change, the quota should be at least 33% of the overall number of positions to be held by women so that critical mass is achieved. Commitments should also connect to international efforts. When developing gender provisions in extractive sector documents, countries should not operate in a vacuum, but instead should build these provisions with the intention to the success, failures, and learnings of other countries and organizations. International organizations such as multilateral lenders, EITI, the UN, and the Open Government Project are synthesized learning to help countries build commitments around extractives that have the potential to make transformative change in their country's development, particularly for women and gender minorities.
Thanks, Liz. So as we wrap up, we're going to let you know our plans for the future, and then we'll turn to questions. So we plan to publish this paper alongside a database of all the documents that we found in this March. So I'm seeing questions in the chat for the webinar about links to specific documents. All of these documents are going to be compiled together in this really pretty database where they're all tagged by country and the different things that they do in connection with what we've outlined in the report. So we're also currently working on 2 short documentaries about the implementation and impact of these documents in Sierra Leone and Mongolia. You can follow our progress via the blog posts on NRGI's websites. So I've dropped a link to one of the blog posts in there. We have a couple. The link that I put was a blog post about the British Mines and Collieries Act of 1842. We've also written blogs about the trend of finding women or gender in the documents, and also about gender data disaggregation. So I can drop links to those if need be, but they're fairly easy to find. If you just Google my name and NRGI, they'll pop up for you. And if you're active in the OGP space or you're intrigued about using OGP to further your own organization's gender transformative goals, please be sure to reach out to us. As we turn to your questions, we're going to switch slides here and put all of our contact information on the screen so that you're able to reach out to us in the future, get in touch, and we can keep working on this. So if you have questions in Arabic or in Spanish, you can email them to the live interpreters, and they'll work on translating your questions and giving them to us during the rest of this webinar. But otherwise, just raise your hand, and Elizabeth and I are going to turn on our videos now, so you can see us. We'll switch off the slideshow, and we're here to answer your questions. So it looks like Carolyn, you have a question. Do you want to we can unmute you, or you can raise your hand and you can ask it to the group. Okay, let's see.
Hi. My name is Carolyn Burns, and I work with the Devonshire Initiative, which is a group of Canadian mining companies and NGOs that come together to improve opportunities for cross-sector collaboration in the mining context. And my question is mostly administrative, sorry. I'm interested in how, if you're doing sort of targeted engagements around the database and the sort of final findings when they're published, because I know a lot of our members would be really keen to hear not just the information in this webinar, but sort of dig in and ask really specific questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So our rollout plan for this has been drastically affected by COVID. We had planned, as everything in the world has, but we had planned to have different events all over the world to roll this out. And unfortunately, that's not happening, but that does give us the opportunity to sort of broaden our online reach and engage with people that way. So if you're interested in having us talk to your group or present some of this research, dig in with you, please just get in touch and we'll work something out. Thanks.
Yeah. Can I also just add that I think through the Open Government Partnership and the sort of national action planning process, there is also opportunity for broader engagement and developing specific commitments that reflect some of these findings in our report.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so Ege, would you like to ask your question out loud to the group?
Hi, hello. It was a great presentation, very, very informative. I was just wondering if you could give some examples of the gender transformative provisions that you came up with. I know that you said that they were not verifiable, but I still would like to hear more about them. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Ege from IGF Secretariat, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Ege. So there were actually in the documents that we looked at, very few documents that we found to be truly gender transformative in their potential. However, there were things, you know, like the one that we mentioned from Mongolia, really realized, okay, we need to, in order to have gender transformative change, we need to change our culture. And that includes changing work-life balance, changing gender stereotypes. You know, there are a lot of sexual harassment issues on mine sites. And in Mongolia, actually, one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is that they're looking at gender not just as a women's issue, but they're looking at how the mining sector also affects men there. So they're talking about how men are separated from their families because they have to work far away on mine sites, and the effect that that has on men's health, as well as, you know, sexual harassment in the workplace, or sex trafficking tends to be an issue around these mine sites as well. So they're really looking at it as a holistic issue rather than just saying, let's slap a quota to have 2 women on this board and that'll solve the problem. So that's one example that I found interesting. And Liz, maybe you really dug into the Canadian policies, which I know had some gender transformative aspects to them. So perhaps you could talk about those.
Yeah, so first, just as a quick caveat, we only looked at national level documents. And so for decentralized countries that might have subnational mining laws, those weren't captured in our report. And that's an actually big issue in Canada because most of the mining laws are actually in their provinces and territories. But I do want to flag the Impact Assessment Act that was mentioned during the presentation, because I do think the intersectionality approach that is taking is really quite transformative. It is really not narrowly looking at gender as a female, male, woman, man, but really looking at all of the identity factors and the way they interplay, and also systematically requiring policymakers to look at those throughout the policy. Their GPA Plus is another example of what Canada is doing to really expand the sort of look at women and gender minorities across all of the policies. And it will be very interesting to see how those national initiatives are trickling down to the provinces and territories as the implementation really takes hold.
Thanks for the question, Ege. Do we have, it looks like Pooja, you have a question?
You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask it directly.
There we are.
Hello, everyone. Sorry. I just had a call in between. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so I was asking whether the cultural dimensions and the cultural beliefs, such as those existing in Africa, for instance, have they been considered in your research? Because we might have great initiatives to enhance equal gender participation, but then it is so difficult to change the perceptions and the cultural practices that have been existing. You know, especially if we're talking about a gender participation in the grassroots around the extraction sites?
Go ahead, Liz. That's a hard
Yeah,
question.
it is a hard question, and I wish we had a more robust answer. The reality is those cultural dimensions are not really reflected in the laws and policies, but are such a critical enabling factor when it comes to implementation and what ultimately will be required to create truly gender transformative initiatives. And so I think that we need to think really strategically on a country level about what additional steps can be done when rolling out policies and guidelines that really take into consideration these cultural dimensions. And really, I think the participation, meaningful and inclusive participation of women and gender minorities is one really important avenue that will allow you to sort of capture some of those cultural dimensions. For example, in other sectors, group meetings where men and women are together is not always the best way to provide for an engaging dialogue. So coming up with specific strategies that respect the cultural dimensions in each country and each area are really critical for implementation.
And I think what your question gets at, Pooja, is that this change can't occur only in the extractive sector. You know, countries have broader based laws, policies, you know, all of these documents that are going to need to be changed to allow for women and gender minorities full participation in the workforce generally. So, you know, some of these countries have, you know, while their extractive governance documents may say one thing, they have prohibitions on the books that don't allow women to own property. So if women aren't able to equally own property, they're not able to equally participate in the extractive sector in terms of, you know, deciding what gets done on that property if they don't have equal access to ownership. And you find those kind of legacies like throughout countries' governing documents. So I think part of the answer to your question is that it can't just happen in the extractive sector. The change has to occur throughout in a country's entire governing framework. So just to make it a little bit harder for us this morning. There we go.
I'm sorry, could I ask a follow-up question?
Mm-hmm.
So in the research that you're doing, have you considered the different contexts? Like, you know, for instance, something that may be relevant for Canada could not be relevant for Africa. So has that been considered?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So we intentionally selected cases that were diverse in terms of culture and economy to try, because what we're doing ultimately is textual analysis. So we're trying to get a broad range of different kinds of governing documents from different countries. So we recognize that what is happening in Canada is going to be necessarily very different than what might be happening in an African country. However, one of the things that is interesting is that sorry, my dog has exhausted her time away from me. I hope you can't hear her barking from the other room. But you know, Canada is also engaged in international assistance and is very deliberately going into countries like Mongolia, for example, and working with them on designing their extractive laws. So you see these extractive laws in Mongolia that are, you know, have gender transformative potential because they're working through international assistance to really change those things. So you end up seeing laws in some place, you know, Sierra Leone, for example, also has some potentially gender transformative legislation. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to consider it as well.
Great, thank you.
If there's anybody else who would like to just raise their hand to ask a question, they're welcome to do that as well as typing it in the chat. Awesome. All right.
Okay, all the dogs have lost their patience and it looks like we don't have any more questions. So we thank you all for your participation today. We really encourage you to get in touch And we look forward to rolling out this research in this database in March, and hope that you'll follow along with the project and engage with the research. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, I'll drop my email address here in the chat.
Yeah, I can do the same.
There.
All right, great. Well then, bye everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate your time.